Okay, I think we are good to go. So welcome to the Sociological Review Foundation's conversation on gender, class and sociology today. This evening, we're going to be taking a fresh and frank look at gender and class in the 21st century, and specifically what insights sociology and sociologists have to offer. It's really great to see so many people here, particularly because it's the first in our new conversation series. And just a little bit of a teaser, the next in the series, we're just working on the date at the moment, is going to be focused on Palestine as a sociological issue, linked to the special section that we recently published on this topic in the journal. So what we want to do through this series in general is to explore why sociological ideas are significant for understanding the world around us today. And it's part of our wider agenda at the Sociological Review Foundation to provide a space to question taken for granted understandings of the social world and a platform for thinking about alternative possibilities for what that might be. And to my mind, I think we need sociology now more than ever. So who am I? I suppose might be a really good place to start. I'm Michaela Benson. I'm Chief Executive of the Sociological Review Foundation, and I'm Professor in Public Sociology at Lancaster University. And I'm going to be chairing this conversation today. And I'm really, really delighted to be kicking off this series by being joined by my two absolutely fabulous guests. So I'm just going to give them a brief introduction and then we'll get going. Bev Skeggs probably doesn't need, well, neither of our guests really need that much of an introduction, but I will provide one anyway. Bev Skeggs is Professor Emerita at Lancaster University, and I think it's fair to say that she's one of the foremost feminist sociologists. She is formerly the editor-in-chief of the Sociological Review, and she occupied the role I have today as chief executive. She was our founding chief executive, I think is probably the best way of putting it. And she left me with some pretty big shoes to fill, I'll be very, very honest. She's managed numerous groundbreaking research projects on inequality and injustice and used a range of innovative research methods. She was previously the academic director of the Atlantic Fellows for Social and Economic Equity programme at the London School of Economics and Political Sciences. And probably most of the people in the room will be most familiar with her landmark book, Formations of Class and Gender, which is actually the focus of a special section that we just published in the Sociological Review earlier this month, and which includes a paper co-authored also by Jo and Helen Wood. So I will turn over to introduce Jo now. Jo Littler is Professor in Cultural Media and Social Analysis at Goldsmiths, University of London, and her research focuses on changing cultures of inequality across media and society. She's written several books as well, most recently, no, not most recently, Against Meritocracy, which was published in 2018, Left Feminisms, Conversations on the Personal and the Political from 2023, and she's the co-author of the CARE Manifesto, The Politics of Interdependence, not independence. She's the co-editor of the European Journal of Cultural Studies and is a member of the editorial collective of the fantastic journal Soundings, which is a journal of politics and culture. And if you haven't come across either of those journals, I really recommend that you go and take a look at them. So I'm really delighted to welcome you both this evening. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
So, first of all, the boring bits, the housekeeping. We've got an hour and a half and we might get carried away and use all of it. But we'll probably try to draw things to a close a little bit sooner. I am aware that some people might be keen to get their dinner if they haven't had it already. I know I certainly will be. And the other piece of housekeeping is how we're going to manage questions this evening. You'll see that we've been joined by a very large number of people. And what we thought it would be best to do on this occasion is to use a rolling Q&A. What that means is that you should put your questions into the Q&A as they occur to you and in line with the topics of conversation that we're discussing. I'll be monitoring these, or trying to at least, with the help of Danielle, our Senior Events Officer, and I will try to bring your questions or the questions that I think are are going to work in the flow of the conversation into the conversation that we'll be having. We'll also be, this is another piece of housekeeping that I think is quite important to just highlight with you. There will be a link to our event feedback put into the chat. We'd really, really appreciate it if after the event or during the event, you take some time to fill it in, as it's really helpful to us to hear thoughts so that we can continue to improve. And it helps us to kind of continue to think about what events might be of interest and the kind of formats for doing this. So that's now done and dusted. Hopefully now we can engage in the conversation, and yeah, please sit back, relax, and listen to and think with us today. So, right, are you ready, Bev and Jo?
Yeah.
You are, great. So Bev, I am going to come to you first. And I think, we're not going to spend the whole event talking about formations of class and gender, but I really did want to come to you and kind of ask this question. Formations was published over 25 years ago. Now, actually, it's getting on to 27, 28 years ago. And I suppose, at the time, did you imagine or think that we'd still be talking about its core themes today?
I didn't even think I'd have a job. So, the idea that something I wrote would actually have a life is really quite remarkable. And I think when I was writing it, I didn't really understand how universities worked and things like that. So for me, it was, I just wanted to get it out there as an argument, effectively, because I was very angry about what was going on around me. But I never really thought about it as an object that could have longevity in any way. So it was really about that moment, and that moment was pretty horrific. It was, and I think one of the things is, are the themes relevant today? Well, I never thought they would be, and I hope they wouldn't be, because, at that point we were surrounded by Thatcherism, the shrinking of the state, cuts to welfare benefits, HIV and AIDS, race riots, the destruction of the working class through the miners' strike. So that it can't get worse than this, can it? And it has. And that's what's been quite astonishing. And I think that's probably why it still has some relevance, because I was trying to address how people live and make themselves into people in the very, very difficult situations that they find themselves. So, it begins with a group of young women who are they're very optimistic and very lively, and they want to have a great life, and they want to be really caring and good. And as the longitudinal ethnography progresses, they get more cynical, as do I. And so in a way, it probably isn't surprising, because I think those issues will be the same as people are grappling with now. How do you live with mountains of debt? How do you live without a job? Do you choose, heat or eat? Those are the things that people are grappling with. So I think it kind of still addresses those, although I think it had to be written as a particular sort of book to get it published. It would have been a lot more engaging if I'd had my own way, but it had to be written as a cultural theory book. And so it really addresses how class and gender work together, sexuality, desire, violence, education, the power of the state and the family. So yes, those are all still relevant, really. So I think that's why it's probably still relevant. And I think I was also I was looking for theories that would make sense of the ethnography. And so I was using Judith Butler very early on because she was talking about cramped lives, about gender as performativity, about sexuality. And it was kind of, that was working for me. I was using anti-racist feminism a lot, and I think that's come to the fore so much more, and that's really important now and has a much, much stronger space. And I was also using male theorists like Butler and Foucault, but kind of really pushing them to work to explain gender. So really, for me, I can see on reflection why it still has relevance. I didn't do enough on ideology, which I should have done, and I'll hand over to Jo on that one, because I know she's working on it. And I think, if anything, the bits that I was told to leave out, which were the bits on ideology, interestingly, and a lot more of the ethnography, I think I would have liked to have still had that in. So yeah, I mean, I was in a very privileged place, really, of being funded to do an ethnography. And not having to finish on time, not having to do courses. I mean, I did have to work all the way through and things, even though I had a scholarship. I couldn't afford to live, but I think I had a much easier time than PhD students have now. And I got funded to do an ethnography, which is incredibly hard to get funding for now. And then I got extra funding to carry on with it in a longitudinal way. So really, that's it.
I mean, I think that's a really great response to that question of like the core themes and why they still resonate today. And certainly when I went back to read the book when we were doing the work to put together the special section on formations, it's remarkable how salient some of those points are in the context. We're going to come back. There is a question in the chat from Mark about why you had to write the book as cultural theory, but perhaps we can park that for now and come back to it later. Jo, I just wondered, from your point of view, obviously you've worked closely with Bev's work and with other people who've been influenced by her, but why do you think that Formations has had such an influence on feminist scholars? And why do you think that work continues to kind of resonate, to be significant, to be taken up, to be adapted?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, when it came out in 97, wasn't it? It was the time when we were told that we were pretty much post-class, that class didn't matter anymore. This was the time when New Labour were embracing the third way. We were told we were at the end of history and that sexism and racism and class had pretty much all been solved. That was the kind of dominant narrative at that kind of socially liberal, neoliberal moment. But and that was particularly prevalent, I think, in academia, in both in social sciences and humanities. And so having a book like that, it was really good to show that class did matter, and to provide a really broad-based, kind of theoretically kind of rich, or rich is the wrong word in this context, isn't it? But kind of a kind of really rich theoretical account of what class is and how it matters, and to really focus on the cultural dimensions of it, and to think about kind of classed feelings, and to show how it's racialized, where it comes from, and how it can be understood. So that's why it was really useful for me, and like a lot of other people, including Helen Wood, who I co-wrote the piece on formations with. And we also kind of point out that in sociology, for example, it formed a counterpoint to Paul Willis's book, Learning to Labour, because Bev shows how working class girls are trained to care in that very gendered way. And it continues to be significant just because gender and class continue to be significant, don't they? But one thing I particularly liked about it, and still like about it, is how it really emphasizes the problems of kind of bourgeois middle class sensibility of possessive individualism. And it highlights throughout the book that there are other ways of being. It shows that these working class girls have networks of care that they reject, that just kind of individualistic striving. And I think that's really powerful. I found that really important going back and looking at it again and reading it.
I think it's this kind of sense of there being other ways of being and giving the space for that and making that audible and visible is really very, very apparent in the book. And it's, Bev, you referred a little bit to some of the kind of, I suppose, like to go back to the question that Marx asked, which is why did you have to write your book as cultural theory, which I think is connected to the kind of question around, why ethnography was not valued at the time, and what that kind of shows you about some of the issues relating to academic publishing is perhaps worth just reflecting on briefly as well, if you don't mind.
Okay, well, in a way, Jo answered it, because the research for it began in 1980, and it went on for a long time. So I got funded to do ethnography, and it was meant to be an ethnography of the family that I got funded for, so that says a lot. But when it came to be published, nobody wanted a book on class. And nobody wanted ethnography. It was the time, exactly as Jo said, of kind of high cultural theory. And so if you included the voices of real people, as they were real, it was seen to be pointless. We should be working with, I don't know, high theory. I'm trying to think we'd gone a lot into things like psychoanalysis, I remember, semiotics. There were lots of hard theory books, and so it was quite bizarre. And I think it might have been Celia Lurie who was influential in this, that she persuaded Theory, Culture and Society, probably one of the most elite cultural journals, to actually publish it. And I got a great publisher, Robert Rocek, who really, really helped me with it. But there was a bit of a struggle to keep class in there. And I think they've been as surprised as I have by its popularity and its longevity. So, when you're publishing, like now, a lot of the publishers that I've worked with in the past don't exist anymore. I mean, they do as people, but they haven't got the jobs. So, publishing is a very highly controlled market, and they dictate what you can write. You don't tell them what you want to write. It's a real hard negotiation at points. And that's what happened. Yeah. So that's how I was controlled by it, really.
Yeah. I mean, those themes, class, I mean, it's difficult perhaps for some people to realize how at a particular point in time, class was not on the agenda, because of course we've gone through this very long period of this kind of rediscovery of class and sociology. But like ethnography, it is one of those topics within sociology that waxes and wanes in terms of whether there's support for it or not. So I think that's kind of really important. And I think the other thing that kind of you did discuss when you were talking about formations there was this started off its life as a PhD project. And I think that's also like something just worth reflecting on. Now, you've both already reflected a little bit on why gender and class are relevant now. But I just wondered if we could start to kind of tease out some of the differences about the kind of conditions at the moment that are shaping gender at class and their intersections. And I was thinking particularly of social media. So Jo, I'm going to come to you first, because I know that this is something that you have written quite a bit on. So I wondered if you wanted to reflect there on social media, which definitely was not around when Bev wrote Formations, believe it or not, and how that's playing into these kinds of conversations around formations of class and gender today.
Yeah. Well, I guess as we started to talk about before, we live in an age when inequalities become really turbocharged thanks to neoliberal capitalism, and which is mutating in front of our eyes into authoritarian fascism, isn't it? in which those extremes of inequality are only becoming more pronounced. So, every year I look at the Oxfam report on global inequality, and this year's is called Takers Not Makers, and it points out how billionaire wealth increased 3 times as fast as it did the year before. So that's a kind of big context, isn't it? And we can see how that it's increasingly choreographed by a bunch of broligarchs, is that the term of the year. It's that in their power, and that the tech overlords have an enormous sway in shaping our culture. But social media itself is pretty multifaceted, isn't it? So we could think about how it's an area of massive distraction, through which we connect, through which we disconnect, in which platform capitalism has this disproportionate influence, exploiting the young, kind of popularizing very filtered versions of femininity and letting misogyny run wild. But it's also the site of popular creativity and resistance to, for example, everyday sexism in the form of what's sometimes called fourth wave digital activism. So so there's lots of things that we could say here. I guess Emma Casey and I wrote about one form of digital identity labor, as we called it, in an article for the Sociological Review a few years ago, when we looked at how some social media is very particularly precarious and classed. So we looked at the cleanfluencer, Mrs. Hinch, and how she kind of operates really interestingly at the whole kind of crux of a series of contradictions. So she retrenches the idea of domestic labor as male, whilst doing work in the public sphere, and she teaches how to be respectable for an age when kind of we're very overworked. The majority of people don't have time to do cleaning, in which we have extended households where kind of skills about cleaning don't get passed down, and in which you have very kind of stratified relationships to cleaning. So for example, there's a whole cadre of people who have cleaners, and there's a whole other cadre of people who, for instance, as Françoise Vergès puts it in her new book, Clean the World. The title of her book is Who Cleans the World, which is a really good way into some of those questions, I think.
Thank you, Jo. I think that's a really nice introduction to thinking about social media. Bev, I'm going to bring you in as well, because of course you've also done some work on Facebook, which I think that picks up on a broader kind of set of themes that very clearly are connected to the earlier work, but which talk about things around value and values. And I wondered if you wanted to reflect a little bit there on inequalities more generally, because I know that the work that you did there with Simon Ewell is not just about class and gender. There are other things going on there that you were able to highlight.
I think in a way, we've missed a bit of history, but I know we probably come back to it. So when the book was published, there was a complete dismissal of the term class by academics. It's always been used on radio, TV, and media as sort of from the 80s onwards as a term of judgment, always being used to denigrate people. And so what we have in the late 1970s, with a particular political economy of television after Thatcherism and New Labour, and all the TV national programs get broken up, is the beginnings of reality TV. And I know we'll talk about representations because they're so important, but we've got this kind of complete denial about the academic or political significance of class. But then we have this amazing output of vitriol against the working class for 10 years minimum. I mean, it's getting a bit better now, but that was really, really horrific. And social media take up that hatred. without reality TV, without those years of derision and hate and denigration, we wouldn't have Trump now. We wouldn't have all sorts of the horrific politics that we have now, and they wouldn't be legitimate. So we have academics say, no, it doesn't matter, we're doing something much more important. And often, I'm not going to name it, but for me, it wasn't important because it's really hard to watch as people's conditions get worse. And people who have everything just deny it. And it's sometimes a very difficult battle to fight. But at the same time, there's just this horror show going on, popular culture and media. And we did Helen, who writes with Jo now, Helen and I did a big project on it on reality TV, and it was awful. I mean, not the project was awful. It was awful to have to watch that much reality TV. But just to see the output was extraordinary. And to see the way now reality TV has become both a form and still influences the content and influences social media massively. So I just wanted to put that in. I'm sorry.
No, I think it's really important. You're right. We kind of skipped that bit, and we are going to come back to representation. But could you just give a little bit more of a sense of what that project involved you doing and who you were working with?
The reality TV project on Facebook.
The reality TV project, seeing as you started to talk about.
Okay. Well, we did it's called Reacting to Reality TV, because we were looking at reactions, and a bit like formations, we wanted to see how different groups responded to these incredibly negatively valued representations of working class women in particular. And we go into the detail. We had 4 different audience groups that we put together with the help of other people, and so we watched TV with them, which was Helen's method, to see how they reacted. And as a result of this, we came up with like a model of how people's reactions, like, oh, disgust, like the real hardcore affects that we have when we see things like that's disgusting, that's horrible, that's revolting, were all about judgment and about how these programs were produced to connect the representation of horror. Men's underpants were one of them, but that's kind of just to give you a very blatant example. Usually it was about how working class women behaved, and attach that very powerful affect to a form of judgment that people were supposed to have, as in revulsion and disgust. And so the kind of connecting together of the affect to the disgust through judgment became really important for us. And that's what we see. And Imogen Tyler did a really good paper. Jo's done lots of papers on how that works in lots of spheres of media. So we looked at audiences as well as looking at text. But I think one of the major arguments was, and people were saying, why are you doing that research? And I was like, well, sensation is becoming our mechanism of political communication. If we don't have like rational conversations anymore. It's all about producing reaction and sensation, and that's what social media does in a way that we couldn't have even anticipated. So that was reality TV. And then just very briefly, the Facebook project, designed, I think, by the genius known as Simon Newell, which used software. So we also had participants. I rarely do research without participants because I probably don't trust what I say. I'd like to hear what other people say. And that was fascinating because we just worked out at that point, and it was very early on, I think it was 2013, how much Facebook was present on people's browsers. And at that point, they denied it all. Now they're open about it. But at that point, they denied everything until they got taken to court by Brussels. And that's another long story. But So we were interested in what was happening behind the scenes and what were they doing on people's browsers, like not literally in there. People think I talk about them being in the screen, but what were they doing and what were they taking and how were they organizing it? And there's some fantastic books. They're all referencing stuff we've written about how people are classified as value, valueless, waste, worth, through the algorithms of social media companies. So even while all this content is spewing out, basically they're trying to produce a picture of who you are and for the future, what is your potential in terms of how they can sell advertisers to go on your browser. So I mean, it's pernicious, nasty, nasty. I mean, this is awful. It kind of gets worse because, for me, that was all about. We'd had these years of denigration and hatred through blatant representations, and then we get everything done through stealth. So we've still got the real nastiness going on the screen, on social media, but almost like underneath, the underpinning is just like categorizing people into whether they're worth or waste. And this has massive impacts on the rest of their lives. It has massive impacts on policing, massive impacts on CVs, getting a job, human resources. So there's this, I call that stratification by stealth, because it's not about class directly, because they're not using social class, they're just kind of cutting people up as much as they possibly can to kind of get the granular. So it's a much more marketing category. Yeah. And people aren't kind of fighting back as they did in the reality TV research, which showed how class operates through that reaction. But that was really nasty. And that's when I think we thought, what the hell, you know, if politics is being organized by this, if these massive, massive companies are making all their money through collecting data, building massive data farms, using all the climate energy, what do we do? And I think we've now moved after that period into what do we do? And that for me is how class and gender is being, well, everything, all differences are being churned up and cut through. So we talked about dividuation instead of individuation, you know, and that started making a lot more sense at that point in time.
I mean, that is a very, very wide range of things that kind of, I think we're going to go into in a little bit more detail as we go through the conversation. I think you've traced there a really nice connection between the kind of the things that Jo started to talk about in terms of I can't pronounce that word, oligarchs and other things. But before we get on to like really going into some of the challenges that people are facing today, obviously you've already started to talk about some of those and we're going to unpack some of that. There's a question in the chat that I think might be worth kind of just reflecting on briefly, which is
sorry
that some, you know, both of you, like that there is an interest, I think, in how people become the scholars that they are. So how people become feminist scholars in this case. And Jo, it's I mean, were there life experiences that brought you to this?
Well, I recently published a slightly too exposing article where I did try to talk about my roots into university and to think about that in the context of, you know, shifting conjuncture in which I was, you know, the kind of last generation really to be able to go to university in the UK with a grant and not pay fees. So I kind of, I looked at how the university has offered, you know, spaces of kind of confusion in terms of class, and there's all the secret rules that you don't necessarily understand at first, and you know, why people go to certain places and why people act in certain ways. And I looked at how it's been a space of community and support, and that's really, you know, happened across institutions as well as within them. But it's also, you know, increasingly a difficult space, isn't it? A site where people are being excluded, a site of care washing, a site in which corporate interests are running increasingly rampant and siphoning off the money from the public sector, and making it difficult for universities to be a place and space of care. So yeah, I wrote about that. I don't know if that really answered the question. I also I'm really interested in this question too, of how people come to be in the places they are, and that's partly why I did the book Left Feminisms, which is a collection of 14 interviews with mostly academics, some of whom are kind of activist academics. And I did that because I was, you know, nosy partly. I wanted to interview some of my heroes and find out how they got to where they did, and to ask questions that feminism's always been really good at, about, you know, yoking together the personal and the political, and also finding a way or a form through which I could make some of the kind of complex and dense theory that exists in the academy, make it more understandable and translatable.
I think that's really helpful, and I think it did answer the question, Jo. I think it kind of connects as well, and Bev, this is where I'm going to bring you in. Liam's asked a question. Jo said there something about some of the challenges around the fact that, you know, care is lacking within universities. But of course, what we're also seeing is a situation within universities today where, you know, particular people find themselves particularly unwelcome. I think that's always been the case of the university sector. Or not seen as legitimate, find themselves devalued. This is Liam's question. And I suppose, drawing on your experience, Bev, when you and I were talking with Chantal Lewis for the interview that we've published in that special section, you told Chantal and I, and I think this has probably been published elsewhere as well, about your experiences of turning up as an undergraduate at university, and what impact that had on you. And I wondered if you were prepared to share that here today,
Well,
reflect on what it might mean for people who will find themselves in a similar position in 2025.
yeah, I think it's quite a shock. Yeah, I had no idea, because I'm quite a kind of social, upfront sort of person. And I had no idea how much energy goes into kind of judging you. So it was a real shock about the way I spoke. I used to say toast, so I don't say that anymore. You know, poor, I can't not say poor. But I mean, you just judged all the time as lacking. So I think my response to it was, well, one, go a bit crazy and have you know, party a lot, and then the other was to actually read everything I possibly could and become relatively good at what I did. And so I remember one occasion, one really nasty young man who'd been really, really mean to me, and, you know, like really, really denigrating me about what I wore and how I looked and things, asked me if I'd write an essay for him and he'd pay me. You know, and I just think, how dare you treat me like that and then expect me not just to be the object of I am the object that made him feel superior, but also like use me as an essay housekeeper, get me to write his essay for him. So it was a horrible experience. I was quietened. And I've got a lot of fronts, so you can imagine how that's quite a surprise for a whole year. But then I kind of came out of myself, because it was a tutor called Mary Maynard who was quite wonderful. And she said, have you ever listened to what these people are saying in seminars? They're not that clever. Just because they say it with confidence, they're not necessarily saying anything worth knowing. She said, listen very, very carefully. And I did. And she was absolutely right. And, you know, I mean, a lot of them just went to university like a finishing school, really. That was also a big shock. And you just somehow have to learn to stand up for yourself. And my dad was very, very good. He was always like, you know, life's shit, life's a struggle, you just got to get through it, kind of thing. But he also said, never, ever respect anybody who doesn't respect you and your opinions. You know, don't value them because they don't value you. And he was quite good at, you know, I still think about that, because I think if something really hurts me, I think, well, who's it coming from? What right do they have to do this to me? And I think that worked quite a lot, you know, when I've been confused as a cleaner in academia when I was a bloody professor. And it's like, what? And you just think, who are you? And I think Pierre Bourdieu's comment about how judgments say so much more about who's making the judgment than they do about who's being judged. So now I kind of turn it on its head and think, why do you hate the working class so much? Why do you especially hate working class women so much? What is it about you that makes you feel you have to denigrate other people in that way? So now I always want to turn it round. So I would advise anybody to just listen very carefully. And listen to the pomposity as well, because that's like very Pierre Bourdieu. You know, listen to how they do it. They speak with such authority, and they're just talking shit, you know. So you've got to you build up defences, and as Jo says, you find allies. That's lovely, a load of hearts came through my screen. But you know, you've got to have allies. That's the most important thing. So I found groups of friends everywhere I've been, groups of friends who've been amazing. You too. And so you need people who are not going to judge you, you know, who are going to like you. And it's not about the work you do. It's about who you are and about being kind and, you know, generous and looking after people. And I just think that's what we have to do. Don't listen to them when they, you know, they'll put you down because they're so insecure themselves. And academia is a space of phenomenal insecurity. And I did it, and I have to own up. You know, there were times when I was horrible, and I'm really sorry. But you're insecure, and that's why you do it.
I suppose kind of what you're like, you know, I think your dad's comments are really useful because what they remind us are that we don't have to play their games of legitimacy making, which is, of course, you know, what the core of those kind of Bourdieusian understandings around class are, those processes through which legitimacy is given to particular bodies, to particular people. And so I think your dad was already on it, really, wasn't he, back in the day? But should we get back to kind of the present day? And I think, you know, it's almost like the questions are anticipating what I was going to ask this evening. And we've got this great question from Surindra, which says, which brings us to Donald Trump. So I'm just going to read you the question because I think it's an absolutely fantastic one. So it says, in light of President Donald Trump's controversial remarks on gender, including his stance on issues such as transgender rights, the concept of gender identity, and the exclusion of gender-related topics from certain policies, how do you see these kinds of political statements shaping public discourse around gender in contemporary times? So there's a second part to the question, if you don't mind. And how do you think Trump's rhetoric influences the ongoing sociological debates about the fluidity of gender, the politics of gender, and the challenges faced by gendered minorities today? So not a small question, quite a big one. Who wants to go first?
Jo, it's your turn. I've been talking too much.
Yeah, well, it's horrible, isn't it? It's hideous to see those pronouncements come out and the list of banned words, including queer and woman, and it's we can see like how you know, we're being encouraged to turn on each other in all kinds of ways through various culture wars rather than unite against the super rich, of which, you know, the oligarchs again, of which Trump is the key example. So I've found lots of reading useful. think about this at the moment. So I found Judith Butler's book useful to think about how these culture wars are pushed aggressively and with considerable media backing from right-wing media, and how they're working through religious spaces in the States and beyond. I found John Clarke's book, The Battle of Britain, really useful in how he talks about the conjuncture, the times we're in, and the kind of shift from that socially liberal moment to the more authoritarian, regressive, hideously patriarchal, anti-queer moment. And I've found, more popular books useful as well, like Ash Sarkar's book, Minority Rule, I think is really great at highlighting how we're, as she puts it, encouraged to kind of take aim at each other sideways and to segment ourselves into increasingly narrow identity positions rather than unite about what we have in common and our common interests. And don't let them, the messages don't let them divide us, really. So yeah, it's the times are depressing, but also there are so many people who don't agree with those agendas, and there's so much resistance on multiple layers that's what we have to kind of take heart from and be ignited by, I think.
Can I add a bit?
Yeah, go for it.
Because I'm theorizing at the moment about masculinity. Now, in 1992, I wrote about masculinity, and I got really bored with it. I'll never write about it again. But I think it's so important at the moment. And I think on the one hand, feminism has been really successful. We've got to take it as a measure of success that they are using every form of state power to push back at us. Law with their, especially in the US, Roe v. Wade, controlling women's bodies. I mean, it's just extraordinary, the real power, the institutional power that is being used to silence women, to make their lives more difficult, which, and not just women, actually, anybody who has been interesting in any way. So I'd say it's a measure of success of queer politics, of anti-racist politics, of gender politics, of trans politics, of every politics that they have to use state power to control the successes that have been achieved, on the one hand. And the reason I think they do this, now this is a theory I'm working on, I haven't quite worked it out, and I might get into serious trouble for this, but the men are who are enforcing this, like the dodgy ones, DOGE. Why aren't we calling it dodgy instead of do whatever we call it? The dodgy politic ones. I mean, they are so inadequate as men. They do not fulfill any of the performance criteria that used to be essential for masculinity. There was a lovely YouTube of Trump and Musk trying to dance at some event. Might have been, I don't know what event it was, but they just looked so inadequate. And you thought, this is what is fueling their hatred. They know they are being laughed at. They know that people don't take them seriously. And so I see it as like a real revenge of inadequate masculinity is coming back at us. And I think Trump is going to be remarkably successful, because think about how many men do not feel adequate. So they, as incredibly powerful men, are connecting to most men in different ways. And that's why Andrew Tate, I'd argue, is so successful, because he says you can have value by being a misogynist, but it's only going to get worse. And this is what really, really worries me, because it's like I know what happens when when people who feel inadequate get laughed at, they get very, very defensive. And if they have access to power, it'll become much, much worse. But what does this do for gender? When you see a country like Sweden and you see a massive gender difference between men voting for the far right and women voting for the left, what is going to happen? How are people, if they are heterosexual, how are they going to connect? And what happens? I mean, I think transgender is probably one of the most important things that has thrown a spanner into the works. But I mean, you know, it's one of the most important things to think about, how gender is not a fixed binary, but the fact that these people want to fix everything in place and fix it institutionally, politically, legally, shows how powerful those movements have been. So, you know, for me, I'd say you just got to keep going and keep struggling and keep pushing back. But I think it's almost impossible against, you know, state power, empire power at the moment. But it just kind of stick with the belief that things can be different. Think that a lot has been achieved. Think, you know, I remember HIV and AIDS and the complete, unbelievable politics of it. And great things were built out of that. Queer politics became very, very strong. Queer, lesbian, gay, I mean, there are lots of different manifestations. And this is why I too would recommend Ash Sarkar, because we can't focus on our differences at this moment in time. We have to focus on our solidarities. And we have to focus on the things that do actually hold us together. And they will be issues. They will be issues like criminalization. There'll be issues about, you know, institutional power working against us. So I will stop. But I think we've got a big problem with inadequate men taking positions of power. And I'm not sure they should be called oligarchs, because that makes them seem inoffensive. I think they should be called really inadequate, rich, powerful men. But I need to get an acronym to go with that.
Dodgy is good.
Dodgy. They're really dodgy.
Well for me too. I mean, you've both kind of anticipated some of the questions. Some of the questions that were coming in as you were saying things, almost as though you were reading the people's minds in the room, because there have been questions about
not even
feminism. Well, I can see them. So how feminism can help us kind of you know, think through this. What kinds of ways might there be to build solidarity across social justice movements? But also, I mean, there's another question here that is about class from Paul, which I think is kind of interesting, and it'd be interesting to get your views on this, which is sociology might have increasingly prioritized class since the 1990s, but that loose political grouping, which traditionally emphasized class, known as the left, seems to currently be in a parlous state in the UK. So what about contemporary class politics in the UK? How would you characterize that? Jo, I'll bring you in. Give Bev a minute to catch her breath.
How would you characterize class politics in the UK?
Yeah, or I suppose, or any thoughts on what that looks like right now? Because it's you know, I think it's changed a lot since that traditional emphasis on class that was known as the left.
Yeah, well, it's always in motion, isn't it? I guess, and always reconfiguring. So we have the kind of the nascent rise of the right and reform and all those energies which are kind of emerging out of the failure of neoliberal culture, neoliberal capitalism, and the failure of any, you know, substantial opposition to that or alternative. Because we have a spectacularly weak centrist Labour government, which isn't addressing any of the inequalities, the class inequalities. You know, it's addressing a few gendered issues around the corners of things. You know, in terms of how rape rape trials are tackled by the police. There are kind of edges of good things, but it's not addressing the inequalities. In fact, it's making them worse, isn't it? Only this week you have the news about the horrific news about cutting welfare benefits rather than going after the dodgy men, the oligarchs. So we, that is just a huge problem. It's a huge problem, and it's a huge space, empty space, in which the right is finding fertile ground. And of course, they have a lot of money. They have a lot of money being pushed to them by the super rich, capitalists, oligarchs. I will use that term again. So yeah, it's a really dangerous moment, and I think that we also have to kind of try to keep the faith and keep the connections going, and think about what new connections we need, because it's a very long game. And there've been a lot of energies that, for example, that have been released and on during the past decade as well. On the left, there's been a lot of interesting new kinds of invigoration. So yes, so I think those are, some of the ways, some of the areas in which we need to look at. There are lots of people like, say, Nadia Whittome, Zara Sultana in the UK who are kind of really great voices. But we need to kind of push for common ownership, push against all the kind of horrible welfare cuts, and think about how to reinvigorate that space, and to be as bold as the right are.
Yeah.
Bev, you look like you were about to jump in.
I was about to say, for me, we need to cohere around issues. And I think one issue that everybody I know would agree on would be wealth tax. I mean, why aren't they doing wealth tax? Why are they taking £6 billion out of welfare and not having a wealth tax? Every decent, well, I'm not going to, everybody we know who works on tax would say that it is possible. And even like, in the US, there's like a millionaires club that says, tax us, please. I mean, I think most people would be willing, who are super, super, super rich, would be willing to be taxed. It's a few who won't, obviously. And there's something about, we need a new message about greed, because the greed is just ridiculous. It's like, why do people need that much money? And I just don't understand it. Every time I see a super yacht, I want to blow it up. But why does anybody need that much money? And it's just so wrong. And so I think there are issues, and they are class issues, and they are gender issues, and they are queer issues, and they are anti-racist issues that we can agree about, and that would be around things like massive redistribution. I also think we need to really begin to call things to account. We've let that slip so much, and it is not right for a Labour government to invite asset managers to come and visit them in Parliament. Asset managers literally buy up state services, strip them of all the money, and then kind of throw them back. And that's why we have, houses falling down, roads not working, trains not working, children's homes not working, care homes not working. It's like, there's really basic things we could organise around. And I think, quite rightly, as Ash Sarkar said, the time for identity difference, we have to get together at the moment. This is crucial. And I have to say, during the 80s, people did. They did actually get together over certain issues like police brutality at points. So I think that's very important. It can be done.
Yeah.
I mean, that is something that you highlight.
Billionaires.
Oh, sorry.
We don't need billionaires or sewage in the water.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. But things like that. But it's getting the message out there, isn't it now? How do we get that message out there? Billionaires don't drink sewage. We need campaigns.
But they do drive their super yachts through it, Bev.
Yeah, and probably spread it around.
But I mean, I suppose, like, I mean, that is something that you have reflected on previously about the types of organizing that you were witnessing during the 1980s when you were doing that work. But I think that for both of you, like when we were having our kind of conversation about what we were going to talk about today, we touched briefly on thinking about what solidarity movements there are and where we're seeing some of the kind of broader political hope, whether that's at a tiny, tiny micro scale, whether it's at the grassroots. What are some of the things that have given you that? And I know, Jo, that this is, you know, sometimes when we were talking immediately preceding to this, you're like, oh, I'm not sure today about that. But where, you know, obviously there are still people who are still struggling, who are still resisting. People are not passively accepting this, are they? Even if, you know, some of those bigger messages, we're not seeing mobilization around them, as you've just suggested, Bev.
Yeah, well, I guess we have the massive example of solidarity with Palestine, don't we? That you're going to be talking about in the next seminar, in the face of brutal genocide, form of BDS marches, protests, and then we have. I mean, when I interviewed Arkuga Emejulu for the Left Feminisms book, she said something which always really stuck with me, which was that activism has to be understood not just in the kind of dramatic activism that young white people, middle class people do on protests, art students do on political protests, but they has to be understood as happening in all kinds of spaces and places that don't get media coverage, in the playground, in the road, in the community centre, in the community block. So in relation to shops and shopping centres, how people connect in different levels. So and she talked about how we need people in all kinds of spaces and places, on the everyday, as well as the big media platforms and political parties, and that I think is really powerful. And then another thing that I guess, to get more international again, another kind of formation that I like a lot is the Ni Una Menos movement in South America, where they have this phrase that's started out as a movement against gendered violence, and it expanded to become this massive movement against neoliberal inequality, basically. And they have this phrase, the debt is owed to us. They have loads of women, queer women, trans women on the street saying the debt is owed to us. It's not something that we owe to the oligarchs, to the dodgy people. And that I think is a really beautiful slogan.
I think that's I think that is a really beautiful slogan, and thank you for sharing that with us, Jo. I mean, one of the questions that's kind of come in here about building solidarity is the extent to which class would be the basis of solidarity across social justice movements. And I wondered whether that was, I think that's worth reflecting on for a minute or two, Bev.
Well, I mean, again, there's been quite a lot written about the difficult class politics, say, of climate change. But I think if we, instead of thinking who is claiming the greatest injury, say, the Wendy Brown politics of injury or victimhood or whatever else, and we focus on a particular issue that needs achieving, like oil, fossil fuels, something like that, there's a lot going on internationally. Brazil is kind of a brilliant example, and COP's going to be held there. I mean, COP's a bit useless, but yeah, well, a bit totally. But again, there's a good government there at the moment that are completely struggling, but I think there's lots of connections that can be made through the issues. And I think examples of where things have been won is really important. And even things like, there's all those difficult theoretical points about where does, protest come from and whatever else, and we never know. It can just happen. And I suspect it will happen, and I suspect it will happen soon. But I do think we have to think about the issues themselves rather than the class divisions or the race divisions or the gender divisions within a particular movement. And I know that's hard as somebody who always was asked to, make the tea meetings when I was young and things like that. So it's just got to focus on how important, we can fight against sewage in water, we can fight against mold in houses, we can fight against people being dispossessed in so many different ways. And I think a lot is going on. I mean, I was surprised in Morecambe. I mean, it's wrong. There shouldn't be lots of food banks, but there's lots of people growing vegetables and giving them away at certain places at certain times of the week. And I thought, if that sort of stuff begins organically, no pun intended, but if that sort of stuff happens, it's really important. I mean, Preston, Jo's written about metropolitanism, Preston tried and it's still trying. And we don't get perfect wins. I think that's the problem. We never, ever get a perfect win, and certainly not in the moment. But we've just got to keep trying, and we've got to agree. I think climate change, and I have to say, much younger people are going to be, much better at this, because we've all been damaged, I think, quite a lot, not in the states of injury, but by the class politics of certain movements.
I mean, I think there's a question, there's a broader question that probably isn't for now about the relationship between, between academia and activism. It's a very large question, but the specific question that's come in from Michelle is to do with how academics could promote more engaged activism. So if either of you had a thought on that before we move on to the promised topic of talking about popular culture.
Oh yeah,
I'd be very grateful.
I'd say if only academics could connect more to activism, we got forced out of it just to stay in a job. So if you want to do activism, you have to make sure that it connects to some performance measure that your university is going to impose upon you. Now, I thought impact that we get measured on would be a really good way of doing activism, but no, it has to be connected to something that the government values. If you go to the impact statement conferences, it has to be something that adds to GDP. So, the activism is being literally organized out of academia. Just don't do it in academia. Do the research in academia that you need to do, and do your activism outside of academia, I say. The chances of holding those two together have been legislated out of, I mean, right from the start, the topics that we did, it's been very, very difficult to keep that connection. Very difficult. I know there was a good group that was trying, but I'd be interested to see what happened.
Yeah, I think I'm interested in this topic from all kinds of ways. And I think, also there's, what the issue of what you can bring to activism as an academic. Obviously, like Bev says, we're all exhausted and we have no time if we've got a job. But there's a value for keeping them separate spheres as well as connected spheres, I think. So, thinking about how we can, kind of educate ourselves in terms of what's going on that relates to what we're working on, what groups are doing work on that, how we might be able to write, say, media articles that connect to the issue in a way that bridges academia and public discourse. So there are a lot of things to do and connections to make. It's just as if we have the time and the energy in this marketized institutions that we live in, work in.
I think that's again, it kind of brings us back to the university in lots of different ways, and what that makes possible and what it doesn't make possible in the current climate. And there are quite a lot of questions about working in the university and the challenges of academia today for people from working class backgrounds, and various other things. I think we're going to have to park them for now, but we will try to come back to you via the email that we circulated after after the session this evening, probably early next week. So I'm really sorry if I haven't been able to pick up on all of those questions, as well as some other really fascinating questions that you've sparked while you've been talking. But before we close, I want to come back to this point. You're both really fascinated by popular culture, and what I think is quite important about your work is how you've both described the significance of that, really, for understanding the production of social inequalities, the resistance to social inequalities that is possible through those spaces. I mean, I'm probably completely butchering exactly what you've said, but I think that like in my conversations with both of you, it comes up very, very clearly that we need to consider popular culture, and it might be that it is there that we find some of those alternatives in respect to thinking about formations of class and gender today. So the very brief question is, and I know that you're not going to give me a brief answer, which is, what are you watching, listening to, reading that speaks to those kind of questions of struggle? I mean, you've mentioned quite a lot of nonfiction work that you've been reading. But in that space of popular culture, Bev, what are you recommending this evening? I'm going to limit you to 3 because I know the list is very long.
Well, Jo and I are writing on Alma's Not Normal, and obviously Rain Dogs. And Jo, what we're writing on? Then if I say the next one, I can't have my 3. So Smoggy Queens and Deadlock, I'd say, are the most important.
That's 4, Bev. I told you 3. Now tell us why.
Well, I think the ones we've looked at in the paper we've written on Alma. Why? Because they're just going. I'm just about to swear, and I'm not allowed to. But they really just depict people like formations, like ethnography. They depict people in the situations that they're living in. But they don't do all that kind of fake pretension and aspiration. They literally represent people in their surroundings, and they're not ashamed of them. They're having a great time in certain, but not a great time always. Rain Dogs is certainly not a great time, but they learn to inhabit them, and they're not ashamed, and they resist all the judgment of them. That's Alma and Rain Dogs. There. Smoggy Queens, because it's set in Middlesbrough, where I grew up, and it's queer. It's really bloody queer. And to get working class queer comedy, amazing, on TV. And it was BBC. I was like, really? I don't believe it. And it's not going to be for everyone. And I think there's a lot of in-jokes. But I think it's absolutely brilliant, really brilliant, and bringing class and gender, and there's some great moments, really great moments in it. And then Deadlock, because it's one of the funniest police procedure programs I've seen for ages, and everybody I've recommended it to has loved it, about 2 women cops in Australia.
Fantastic. Jo, it's over to you. Unless Bev's stolen all of the recommendations.
I can't use Alma or Rain Dogs or chewing gum now, can I? But yeah, like Bev said,
chewing gum, yeah.
How they're kind of sticking 2 fingers up at the stigma, and they're bold, and they don't care about that, and they just reject that neoliberal meritocratic social mobility narrative that you just need to work hard to make it, and if you don't, it's your own fault. So we kind of love that about them. I guess I've just to think about more international ones. I really enjoyed Reservation Dogs, which is like set on a kind of indigenous American reservation. It's a bunch of teenagers, and it's really funny about kind of lingering effects, class effects of impoverishment and kind of racialization, but it does so with a really deft, light touch, and it's kind of it's incredibly funny and inventive and kind of deep, I think. And then I've really, just to think about masculinity a bit, because we've talked about that. I've been really enjoying Big Boys on Channel 4, which I think is kind of very good at looking at mixed class and different communities. So it's got a kind of white working class lad who's kind of struggling with emotional literacy and his kind of mental health, and then another kind of working class lower middle class guy who's kind of struggling with his sexuality. And it's really quite a rare thing to watch, and it's done again really sensitively, but also with the kind of humor that we all need in these shit times. And then I've been listening to, because I keep listening to books on Audible because as my time shrinks, and I've been listening to The Trading Game by Gary Stevenson, which I was really glad to see that Penguin picked that up after publishing Jordan Peterson. That was much better. So he's a guy from Ilford, working class boy from Ilford, and he talks about growing up and wanting to make it, and then kind of scrambling his way through university to the trading floor and making millions, and then realizing that he's become super rich, a millionaire, by gambling on the world ending. And then the book in the later stages is all about how he kind of realizes what's going on with the global economy and how he kind of moves into education and kind of tries to leave these corporate institutions that have him there. So that's kind of really interesting of the moment read as well. Listen.
I mean, I think that this is like, it shows you that we can find the kind of the sociological in the world around us as well. It's not just, you know, as I've said many times, and I've probably stolen it from someone else, that the sociological imagination is not the monopoly of sociologists, and we can get inspiration from looking at all of those things, at popular culture, at media, at literature, as we've always been able to do. So I think that that's yeah, sorry, I've just like seen the final, like the question in the chat that's just come in, which says that they're wondering about whether there's academic theory or work that highlights the more positive parts of being working class, if there is any. So this has come from someone else, and I mean, I think both of you could probably come up with kind of work on that resists, that talks about resistance, that talks about struggles, that talks about the values people and communities create for themselves. But perhaps that's one for us to take away and to add to that list that we'll circulate when we circulate the email next week to everybody who's been in attendance. So just to say, I'm parking that for later. I think probably, unless either of you have got anything else to add, well, I'm asking you, is there anything else that you really urgently want to say before we close the conversation for this evening?
Anything by Carolyn Ahern and Sophie Willan or Michaela Cole should be watched. And also, do people listen to the critical programs on Radio 4 called Naked Week? That's been very good.
And I guess it's interesting, a lot of the recommendations that we've had are memoirs, and there's a whole kind of crossover zone, isn't there, of autobiography and sociology called autosociobiography, another really long word. But yeah, Bev and I were interested in how it's often a lot of the kind of male sociologists and their autobiographical work that are given the oxygen of publicity, like Bourdieu and Didier Eribon. And when you have this kind of huge, massive seam of writing by women, you know, Audre Lorde, Carolyn Steedman, Annie Ernaux. And then we got interested in how there are so many kind of working class women making, and queer people making TV shows that are auto-socio-biographical as well, which kind of draw on their experience of life and class. And so that's another like nice zone of connection.
Thank you. That's going to be loads of recommendations, and I think those are really, really important reflections. So thank you to both of you for joining me this evening in conversation. And just before we go, just a couple of things. I do need to say thank you to Danielle Galway, who's our Senior Events Officer, for her work making this happen and the technical support and to Karen Shook, our Senior Communications Officer. You might be in communication with them via some of the responses. And last but not least, thank you to everybody who's come along this evening. It's really great to see you being here. We really appreciate your support and the donations that have come in via your attendance. But of course, you know, we thank all of you for being here. As I said at the outset, the next conversation is going to be focused on Palestine as a sociological issue, and we'll circulate information about that. Hopefully, we'll have that early next week to send to you in that bumper email that seems like we're going to be putting together to send out to all of you who are going to who've been here this evening. And I have another announcement as well. Anybody who is attending the British Sociological Association conference, which is at the end of April in Manchester, we will be collaborating with Manchester Metropolitan University, Manchester University Press, and colleagues in the Department of Sociology at Manchester University in hosting a sociological pub quiz. And we'll be, I think that the information about that's going to be on the chat. We welcome anyone to come along. You don't need to bring your own team. You can come and we will find a team for you. To find out about anything else that's going on at the Sociological Review Foundation, there is always a lot. You can sign up to our newsletter, which is also going to be, there will be a link in the chat as well. And please do remember to take a minute to fill out the feedback form. We really do appreciate any feedback you can give so that we can feed it into how we do things in the future. And we will be sharing the video next week as well, so that will be available. And I think that's all from me for this evening. So thank you all very much for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have. Enjoying might not be the right word about some of the topics discussed, but yeah, thanks so much, everybody.